She was cutting through the hotel kitchen corridor when she heard it. A cough. Low, rough, the kind that sounds like something inside never fully healed. Through the service window, she saw a man unloading produce crates. Big hands. Worn jacket. Moving quietly, like someone used to being invisible in rooms like this. Then he stopped. His left hand drifted up to his chest, slowly, automatically, and pressed flat against his ribs. Eyes closed for just a second. Jaw tight, like a habit he'd carried for years without noticing. She had seen that exact gesture before. Once. 10 years ago. In the dark. When the ceiling was coming down and she couldn't breathe, and a stranger's hand had found hers and pulled. She stepped back from the window. The man finished unloading, wheeled his cart toward the exit, and disappeared without ever looking up. She stood in that corridor for a long time after he was gone. Then she opened her phone and called the one person she trusted to find anyone, anywhere, no questions asked. She needed a name, and she needed to know if she was right, or if 10 years of guilt had finally made her lose her mind. Maya Chen did not believe in luck. She believed in systems, in data, in the kind of careful, methodical thinking that turns chaos into something manageable. Every decision she made at ClearPath Technologies, from hiring to product roadmaps to which investors got a seat at the table, ran through the same internal filter. What does the data say? What is the risk? What can I control? At 34, she had built a medical AI startup from a 2-person operation in a rented garage into a company valued at over $500 million. Tech magazines called her a visionary. Her board called her relentless. Her assistant, who had worked for her for 3 years, called her, privately, carefully, a little terrifying. Maya called herself prepared. Her office on the 22nd floor of a glass tower in San Francisco reflected exactly that. Clean lines, no clutter, a whiteboard covered in decision trees and risk matrices, a standing desk she actually stood at, and on the corner of that desk, face down, a small photograph that no one in the office was allowed to ask about. Not because she had ever said so out loud, just because something in her expression, whenever anyone's eyes drifted toward it, made it very clear that the conversation would end there. The photo was taken at a disaster site, a collapsed building. The year was 2014, and the man in the background of that image, the one standing just to the left of the rescue perimeter talking to another firefighter, had not made it home that night. Maya had. She still wasn't entirely sure why. She didn't sleep well. She hadn't in 10 years. Most nights, she was back at her desk by 2 a.m, coffee in hand, reading through quarterly projections or stress-testing financial models. Anything that required enough focus to keep the other thoughts out. People around her assumed she was driven by ambition, and she was, in part, but ambition was the surface layer. Underneath it was something older and quieter and much harder to name. The persistent, low-grade feeling that she had been given something she hadn't earned, and that the only acceptable response was to spend the rest of her life making it worth the cost. She just hadn't figured out yet who had paid that cost. Until the night of the gala, across the bay, in a quieter part of the world, Ethan Cole was already awake. He was always awake before the sun, not because he set an alarm, he hadn't used one in years, but because the farm had its own schedule, and he had learned long ago to match it. The tomatoes needed checking before the heat of the day set in. The drip lines along the east beds had been running slow all week, and he still hadn't figured out why. And his mother, Dorothy, tended to wake confused if she found the house empty, so he liked to have coffee ready and the radio on before she opened her bedroom door. Ember Acres was not a large operation. 2 acres of cultivated land on the eastern edge of Oakland. Hemmed in on one side by a chain-link fence, and on the other by a row of eucalyptus trees that dropped their bark in long, pale strips every summer. Ethan had built most of it himself. The raised beds, the small greenhouse, the irrigation lines, the little wooden shed that served as his office, storage room, and occasionally a place to sit in silence when the day got too heavy. He supplied organic produce to a handful of local restaurants and a farmer's market that ran every Saturday 3 miles down the road. It was not a profitable business, not in any meaningful sense, but it was his, every square foot of it, every seed he had pressed into the soil with his own hands. That mattered to him more than he could easily explain to anyone who hadn't lost something first. Ethan had been a firefighter for 11 years. He had loved the work in a way that was hard to separate from who he was as a person. The structure of it, the teamwork, the particular clarity that comes when everything is on fire and the only thing that matters is the next right move. He had been good at it, decorated even, though he never displayed any of that. The call that ended his career came on a Tuesday morning in October. A mid-rise office building in the financial district, earthquake damage, partial structural collapse on floors 4 through 7. Multiple people trapped. His unit was second on scene. He went in. He found a woman on the 5th floor, pinned under a section of collapsed ceiling, barely conscious. He got her out. He was making his second pass through the smoke when the ventilation shaft above him gave way, and he inhaled a lungful of something that turned out to be far worse than ordinary smoke. He didn't know that yet when he walked out of the building. He felt fine, or fine enough. A little dizzy. His chest felt tight, but that was normal after long exposure. 6 months later, a pulmonologist showed him his lung scans and used the word permanent. 18 months after that, he handed in his gear. He didn't talk about it much. Not because it still made him angry, he had moved through the anger a long time ago, but because he refused to let it become the main thing people knew about him. He was not a cautionary tale. He was not an inspiration story either. He was just a man who had lost one life and built another one, slowly, row by row, season by season, in the dirt. What he hadn't fully anticipated was how expensive it would be to keep both things alive at once. Dorothy's diagnosis had come 2 years ago. Early-stage Alzheimer's, the neurologist said, which sounded almost manageable until it wasn't. The disease moved at its own pace, indifferent to budgets or plans. Some days his mother was completely herself, sharp, funny, asking pointed questions about why he hadn't found someone to settle down with yet. Other days she called him by his father's name, or stood in the kitchen at midnight, looking for a house she hadn't lived in for 30 years. The medication helped, but medication cost money. Specialist visits cost money. The small modifications he had made to the house, grab bars, a door alarm, a medical alert system, cost money. And the farm, which had never been a gold mine, was increasingly struggling to cover even its own operating costs. Ethan had cut everything he could cut. He skipped his own doctor's appointments. He bought his own groceries from whatever was left over at the end of the market. He hadn't replaced the greenhouse heating unit that had broken in February, which meant the seedlings had to be moved inside the main house every time the temperature dropped, which Dorothy thought was wonderful and which made the living room look like a very committed science experiment. He was managing. Barely, but managing. He was not looking for help. He had never looked for help. That was simply not how he was built. The night of the charity gala, Ethan was supposed to have finished his delivery by 4 in the afternoon. He hadn't planned to be anywhere near the Fairmont that evening. His contact at the catering company had called him at 2. The regular organic supplier had a truck breakdown. Could Ethan cover the order? They'd pay him double the rate. He needed the money. He said yes. He loaded the van, drove into the city, pulled into the hotel's service entrance, and spent the better part of an hour moving wooden crates through the back corridor into the kitchen. It was loud and warm, and the kitchen staff barely looked at him, which suited him perfectly. At some point, without really meaning to, He stopped. His chest had been tightening all afternoon. The damp air coming in off the bay always did that, and he pressed his palm flat against his ribs the way he always did when it got bad. Closed his eyes for a second, breathed slowly until the tightness backed off. Then he picked up the next crate and kept moving. He was gone by 6. He never saw the woman standing on the other side of the service window. Maya spent the rest of that night doing what she did best. She went back to the gala. She gave her speech. She smiled at the right people and said the right things, and raised more money than the event had projected. Then she went home, sat down at her desk, and opened her laptop. By midnight, she had a name. By 2 in the morning, she had an address, a business registration, and a full financial picture of Ember Acres. Assets, liabilities, outstanding debts, the works. She had contacts in places most people didn't know existed, and she was not shy about using them when she needed to. By 3, she had the medical records. Not directly, she was careful about that, but through a lawyer she trusted, who knew how to ask questions without leaving fingerprints. She sat in her dark office and read through everything. The lung damage. Permanent, progressive, managed but not treatable. The firefighter pension that barely covered basic expenses. The farm's operating deficit. Dorothy Cole, 68 years old, Alzheimer's stage 2, currently on a reduced dosage of her primary medication because the full prescription cost more than the month's budget allowed. Maya set the papers down. She had spent 10 years telling herself that she didn't know who had pulled her out of that building, that she had tried to find out and couldn't, that there was nothing she could have done. None of that was entirely true. She had looked once, briefly, and then stopped, because some part of her hadn't been ready to know, hadn't been ready to face whatever she might find on the other side of that answer. Now she knew. And sitting alone in the quiet of her 22nd floor office, surrounded by all the systems and structures she had built to keep herself safe from exactly this kind of feeling, she put her face in her hands and cried. Not from guilt, exactly. She had lived with guilt long enough that it had become almost like background noise, always there, easy to tune out. She cried because she had finally found the variable she hadn't been able to account for, the one missing piece in the equation she had been trying to solve for a decade. And now that she had it, she was absolutely certain she could fix it. She just needed to be careful about how. That was her first mistake. Not finding him, not wanting to help, but believing, the way she always believed, the way she had built an entire career on believing, that the right system, applied carefully enough, could solve anything. Even people. Even people like Ethan Cole. Maya did not act impulsively. That was important to understand about her. She spent 2 weeks planning before she moved a single dollar. She mapped out every possible way Ethan Cole might react to being helped, and she eliminated every option that had even a small chance of triggering his pride. A direct donation? Obviously no. A government grant? He would research it, and government grants left paper trails. A GoFundMe or any kind of public fundraising? Absolutely not. She had read enough about him to know that public sympathy was the last thing he would accept. What she needed was something that looked completely legitimate, something that felt earned, not given. So she built it from scratch. She called it Green Root Capital, a sustainable agriculture investment fund. She registered it as an independent LLC, hired a real board of 3 people who actually worked in the agricultural sector, built a professional website with a mission statement and everything, and seeded it with enough of her own money to make it look like an established operation. Then Green Root Capital announced its first grant recipient, Ember Acres Urban Farm, Oakland, California. $200,000, no strings attached, in recognition of outstanding contribution to local food sustainability. At the same time, through a separate channel, a health insurance broker she had used before for corporate accounts, She arranged for Dorothy Cole's full medical costs to be quietly absorbed into a group policy. The paperwork looked routine. The premiums were paid from a holding account with no visible connection to Maya or ClearPath Technologies. She sat back and looked at what she had built. It was, she thought, one of the cleaner pieces of work she had ever done. Ethan received the grant notification on a Thursday morning. He read the letter twice. Then he set it on the kitchen table and made himself a second cup of coffee and read it again. $200,000 was not a number that appeared in his life. Not now, maybe not ever. It was enough to wipe out every debt on the farm, replace the greenhouse heating unit, buy his mother's medication at full dosage for the next 4 years, and still have money left over to hire part-time help for the harvest season. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt a small, persistent unease that he couldn't quite locate or name. He folded the letter, put it in the drawer under the kitchen counter, and went out to check the drip lines. He called his lawyer on Friday, not because he had decided anything yet, just because Marcus had been his lawyer since the workers' compensation case after he left the fire department. And Marcus was the kind of person Ethan trusted to look at something and tell him plainly what he was actually looking at. "Look into Green Root Capital for me," he said. "Everything you can find." "You get a grant?"
Maybe.
Marcus called back 3 weeks later. His voice, when he spoke, had the particular careful flatness of someone delivering news they already know the recipient won't like. "Green Root Capital was registered as an LLC 6 weeks ago," Marcus said. "The address on file is 1 Market Plaza, Suite 2200, San Francisco." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "And?" "ClearPath Technologies is also registered at 1 Market Plaza, Suite 2200. The line was silent for a long time. "The third board member," Marcus continued, "is a woman named Rachel Chen. She's listed as an independent agricultural consultant. She's also Maya Chen's first cousin. I found her on LinkedIn. She's been working as a project coordinator at ClearPath for the past 2 years. Ethan set his coffee mug down on the counter very carefully. "Thank you," he said. "That's everything I needed." He hung up, walked to the kitchen drawer, took out the grant letter and looked at it for a long moment. Then he found an envelope, folded the check inside it, put on his jacket, and drove to San Francisco. ClearPath Technologies occupied 4 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building that was all reflections and sharp angles, designed to make you feel slightly underdressed just by standing in front of it. Ethan parked in a public garage 2 blocks away and walked in. The lobby receptionist asked if he had an appointment. He said no. He said he was there to see Maya Chen and that he would wait. He sat down in one of the low, modern chairs by the window, still in his work jacket, boots leaving faint traces of dried mud on the polished concrete floor, and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that most things worth doing required simply outlasting the resistance. 40 minutes later, a young assistant came to collect him. Maya's office was exactly what he had expected. Clean, controlled, everything in its place. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the bay, a whiteboard covered in writing, a desk that probably cost more than his van. She was standing when he walked in. She had known, somehow, before he even sat down. He could see it in the way she held herself, ready but not comfortable. The way someone stands when they're bracing for something they've been half expecting. He placed the envelope on her desk. She looked at it. She didn't touch it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "How long did it take you to build the cover?" he asked. His voice was calm, not the calm of someone who wasn't angry, but the calm of someone who had decided that anger wasn't the most useful tool right now. 3 weeks, she said. It was good work. Not good enough, apparently. He didn't smile. No. She looked at him directly then, really looked at him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to do through the kitchen window that night at the hotel. He was older than she'd imagined, though she didn't know exactly what she had imagined. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't come from laughing. He held himself very straight. which she guessed was habit from years of physical work, but there was something careful about it too, like someone who had learned to compensate for a body that didn't always cooperate. "I only wanted to," she started. "I know what you wanted." He cut her off gently, without heat. "You wanted to sleep better." The words landed exactly where he meant them to. She didn't deny it. There was a pause. Maya was not accustomed to pauses. She usually filled them. But something about the way Ethan simply sat with silence made her feel that speaking first would be a mistake. So she did something she almost never did. She changed tactics. "His name was David," she said quietly. "He was standing next to me in the elevator when the earthquake hit. We'd never met before. He worked on the 9th floor. I was on the 7th. She paused. He didn't make it out. Ethan watched her. "I've been carrying that for 10 years, she said. "And then I find out that the man who pulled me out of that building is living 40 minutes away, running a farm that's about to go under, taking care of his sick mother alone, cutting her medication in half because he can't afford the full dose." Her voice stayed steady, but only just. "What was I supposed to do with that?" "You were supposed to do nothing," he said. "Or you were supposed to come and talk to me like a human being. You would have said no." "Yes. So I tried to find another way." "You tried to find a way that didn't require asking my permission." He leaned forward slightly. "There's a difference." She reached for her argument then, the one she had been saving, the one that she knew was accurate and she knew would hurt. "Your mother had to cut her Aricept dosage in half last month," she said. Her voice was flat, clinical, the same voice she used in board meetings when she needed to make a point land without emotion getting in the way. For a patient in mid-stage Alzheimer's, reducing that medication doesn't just mean slower improvement. It means faster decline. We're talking about a measurable acceleration, potentially 6 months of additional cognitive loss that wouldn't have happened otherwise. She looked at him steadily. "You refused the money because of your pride. Dorothy pays for that with her memory." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She watched his jaw tighten, watched him absorb it. Then he said, very quietly, "You just used my mother's medical records to win an argument." It hit her like a door closing. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Because he was right. She had crossed a line so cleanly and so automatically that she hadn't even registered doing it. She had simply reached for the most effective available data point and deployed it, the way she always did. She started. "You had someone pull her private health information," he said, "without her consent, without mine." He stood up slowly. "And then you used it as leverage." "That's not what I was trying to do." "It doesn't matter what you were trying to do." He picked up the envelope from the desk. "You want to know what the difference is between you and me?" He wasn't angry. That was the thing. He wasn't angry at all anymore. And somehow that was harder to sit with than anger would have been. "I ran into a burning building and lost my career. I didn't do it for a reward. I didn't do it expecting anything back. I did it because someone needed help, and I was the person standing there." He looked at her. "You found out about me and spent 3 weeks building a fake company so you wouldn't have to look me in the eye and ask. Because asking would have meant I could say no. And you don't know how to let variables say no." "That's not fair," she said. "You're right. It's not." He set the envelope back down, not on her desk this time, but in front of her, squarely, where she would have to physically move it to put it anywhere else. "But it's true." He turned toward the door. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "That I was wrong? I was wrong. That I overstepped? I overstepped. But he's still not getting his full medication. And the farm is still 3 months away from defaulting on its operating loan, and I still..." "Still what?" She stopped. Still feel like it's your debt to pay? He finished for her. Not unkindly, just accurately. She didn't answer. It's not, he said. It was never a transaction. You don't owe me anything. And I don't want anything from you. He paused at the door. I'm sorry about David. Then he left. The glass door swung shut behind him with a quiet, expensive click. Maya stood in her office for a long time after he was gone. The envelope sat on the desk where he had left it. $200,000. 3 weeks of careful, precise, well-intentioned work. An entire architecture of good intentions, dismantled in under 20 minutes by a man in a muddy jacket who hadn't raised his voice once. She walked to the window. The bay was flat and gray in the late afternoon light. Somewhere across that water, Ethan Cole was driving back to his farm. Back to his drip lines and his seedlings and his mother who called him by his father's name some mornings. Back to the life he had built from nothing, piece by piece, because he had needed something to build. On her desk, behind her, the envelope sat untouched. And on her phone, a weather notification appeared. Quiet, easy to miss, the kind of thing most people would swipe away without reading. Tropical storm system forming over the Pacific. Projected landfall, Northern California coast. Timeline, 72 hours. Confidence, high. Maya stared at it for a moment. Then she looked at the envelope again. Ember Acres had just lost its $200,000 lifeline, and a Category 2 storm was 3 days away. The storm arrived faster than predicted. By Thursday evening, the wind had already picked up along the coast. Not violent yet, but insistent, the kind that rattles windows and bends young trees sideways and makes animals restless. By Friday morning, the sky over Oakland had turned the specific shade of yellow-gray that people who grew up near the water learned to recognize and respect. Ethan had been watching the forecast all week. He knew what was coming. He had done the math a dozen times, turning the numbers over in his head the way he turned soil, methodically, looking for something solid underneath. The greenhouse needed reinforcing. The north-facing beds needed coverings. The drainage channels along the east perimeter had to be cleared before the rain came, or the lower beds would flood within the first hour. He had a list. He had a plan. What he didn't have was money. The $200,000 grant he had returned 3 days ago would have covered everything. The storm tarps, the reinforced cable ties for the greenhouse frame, the sandbags for the drainage walls. Without it, he had worked through what he could actually afford. A partial roll of heavy plastic sheeting, some rope he already owned, and whatever ingenuity he could apply to the problem before the wind made working outside impossible. He started at 5 in the morning. By noon, his hands were raw and his chest was tight, and he had covered maybe half of what he needed to cover. The temperature had dropped significantly overnight, and cold, damp air was the specific combination his lungs hated most. He had been ignoring the tightness all morning, pressing his palm flat against his ribs whenever it got bad, and then moving on, the same way he always did. Dorothy brought him lunch at the greenhouse door, a sandwich and a thermos of coffee, assembled carefully, the way she did on her good days when she remembered that he forgot to eat when he was focused on something. "It's going to be a bad one," she said, looking up at the sky. "It'll pass," he said. She gave him the look she had been giving him since he was 12 years old. The one that meant, "I know you're not telling me the full truth, and I'm choosing to let it go for now." Then she went back inside. He finished the sandwich, standing in the doorway of the greenhouse, looking at everything he still hadn't secured, calculating time against weather, against the diminishing strength in his arms, and felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely cornered. He didn't call anyone. That was not how he operated. He had made his choices, returned the money, drawn his lines. He would deal with what came. He always had. What he did not account for was Dorothy. It happened at 8:15 in the evening, when the storm had officially made landfall, and the rain was coming in hard, near horizontal sheets. Ethan was inside, moving seedling trays away from the windows, when he noticed that the back door was open. He crossed to it. Rain was blowing straight in across the kitchen floor. He called her name. No answer. He grabbed his flashlight and went out into the dark. Dorothy had taken his rain jacket from the hook by the door, the old yellow one he wore for outdoor work, and put it on over her pajamas. She was walking down the farm's main dirt path toward the road, steadily and with purpose, the way she walked when she was certain about something. He caught up with her at the gate. "Mom." He put his hand on her shoulder gently. "Mom, where are you going?" She turned and looked at him. Her eyes in the flashlight beam were alert and certain. This was not the confused, searching expression of her bad days. This was something else. "I'm going to the station," she said. "Your father's on a double shift. Someone should bring him dinner." His father had been dead for 11 years. "Come back inside," Ethan said. "It's not safe out here. He forgets to eat when he's working." She looked at him, the way you look at someone who is making a simple thing complicated. You know how he is. He steered her gently back toward the gate. She came without resistance for a few steps, then stopped and looked around. At the dark, at the rain, at the unfamiliar shapes of the farm in the storm. And for just a moment, he saw her face shift, the certainty dissolving into something more uncertain, more frightened. "Ethan," she said. Not his father's name. His. "I'm here," he said. "I don't know where I am." "You're home. Come on, I've got you." He got her back to the porch, got her inside, settled her in the armchair with a blanket and the small lamp on and the radio playing softly. The things that usually helped orient her when the world felt slippery. She was calm within minutes, eyes half closed. The crisis passed as quickly as it had arrived. He stood in the kitchen and felt his chest constrict. Not from the cold this time. He pressed his back against the wall, breathed slowly, looked at the ceiling. He could not be in two places at once. He could not watch Dorothy and save the greenhouse. He could not run after her in the dark and also hold down the frame before the wind took it. He was one person, with compromised lungs and a farm that was about to lose its entire autumn harvest. And tonight, for the first time in years, one person was not enough. He went to the living room doorway. Dorothy was in the armchair, eyes half closed, the small lamp throwing a warm circle of light across her lap. The radio was playing something low and familiar, an old country station she had listened to for 40 years. He watched her for a moment. Her breathing was slow and even. The door alarm was set. The front and back doors were locked from the inside, the keys on the high hook she couldn't reach on her best days. It was not a perfect solution. It was the only one he had. He did not call anyone. He went back outside. Maya had been sitting in the parking garage of her office building for 40 minutes. The board meeting had run long. It always did when the agenda included anything related to the IPO timeline. There had been projections, debates, a 20-minute argument about market positioning that she had ultimately settled by laying out 3 scenarios on the whiteboard and asking everyone to pick one based purely on the numbers. They had picked the right one. They always did when she made the options clear enough. She had been brilliant in that meeting. Present, sharp, exactly the leader her board needed her to be. And she had spent the entire second half of it watching the storm radar update on her phone under the table. Ember Acres sat directly in the projected path. She had looked it up 3 times during the projections presentation, the farm's coordinates, the storm track, the timing. She knew, with the same certainty she brought to financial models, that the greenhouse would not survive a Category 2 without proper reinforcement, and she knew equally that Ethan had sent back every dollar that would have paid for that reinforcement. She sat in her car in the parking garage and argued with herself. She had no standing to go. He had told her clearly to leave him alone. She had already overstepped once, badly, and he had been right about every part of it. Showing up at his farm in the middle of a hurricane was not helping. It was exactly the kind of unilateral, I know better behavior he had already called her out for. She should go home. She started the car. Then she turned it off again. She thought about what he had said. I did it because someone needed help, and I was the person standing there. She was the person standing here. Or sitting here, anyway, in a parking garage, in the dry, 40 minutes away from a farm that was going under in a storm that she could not control and he could not afford. She thought about Dorothy Cole, 68 years old, Alzheimer's stage 2, alone in a farmhouse while her son fought a storm outside with rope and plastic sheeting and whatever strength his damaged lungs had left. She started the car again. This time she drove. She arrived at Ember Acres at 9:45. The farmhouse lights were on. The front door was closed, but she could see through the side window that the lamp in the living room was lit, which meant someone was inside. She parked on the road and got out into the rain. She was not dressed for this. She had changed out of her work clothes after the meeting, but what she had changed into was not significantly better. Jeans, a fleece, a rain jacket that was designed more for San Francisco drizzle than for a storm that was currently trying to remove her from the ground. She pushed through the gate and walked up the path. Ethan was at the greenhouse. She could see his flashlight moving through the plastic sheeting, hear the sound of something banging against the frame in the wind. She crossed the yard toward him, head down against the rain. He saw her before she reached him. He stopped what he was doing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind filled the silence between them. "My mother?" he said finally. "I just got here. I haven't been inside yet." He nodded, just once. Then he turned back to the greenhouse frame. She looked at what he was working with. The rope, the partial roll of sheeting, the way the north corner of the structure was already beginning to lift in the gusts, and she understood immediately that what he had was not enough. Not even close. She took off her jacket, tied it around her waist, and grabbed the loose end of the sheeting. "Where do you need this anchored?" He looked at her. "Southeast corner," he said. "There's a ground stake 3 feet out from the base." She found it in the dark by running her hand along the wet ground. She pulled the sheeting taut, looped it around the stake, and held it while he moved to the next anchor point. They worked without talking. The rain was too loud for conversation anyway, and there was nothing to say that the work wasn't already saying. She calculated load distribution from the way the frame was flexing. 4 years of engineering coursework that she had never expected to use in a field in the rain at 10 o'clock at night, and redirected their efforts to the points that would fail first. He followed her lead without question, applied his strength where she pointed, and between the two of them they moved faster than either could have managed alone. The cable on the northwest corner snapped loose in a gust, and Maya caught it with both hands. The force of it cut across her palms. She felt it, registered it, held on. Ethan reached her in 3 steps. He didn't tell her to let go. He put his hands over hers on the cable and pulled with her, and together they walked it back to the anchor and wrapped it twice and drove the stake deeper into the mud with his boot heel. She was shaking. From cold, from adrenaline, or from something she didn't have a name for yet. He looked down at her hands. Even in the dark, she could see the expression on his face change. He didn't say anything. He reached into his jacket pocket, found an old work rag, and wrapped it around her right hand without asking. Then he held it there for a moment, his hands around hers, until the shaking slowed. That was all. They went back to work. At some point, she couldn't have said exactly when, Ethan stopped. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. He just stood still, one hand on the greenhouse frame, head down, breathing in the specific, careful way of someone managing a body that has reached its limit. The cough came without warning. Deep, wrenching, the kind she had heard through the kitchen window that first night, and recognized without knowing why. He turned away from her. His shoulders shook with it. When he straightened back up, she was standing a few feet away, not touching him, not speaking. He looked at her. She looked at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan did something she hadn't seen him do once in all the time she had known him. He sat down. Not carefully, not deliberately. He just lowered himself onto the wet ground at the base of the greenhouse frame and stayed there, back against the post, head tipped back slightly, eyes closed, like a man who had finally put down something very heavy and wasn't ready to pick it up again yet. Maya stood a few feet away and did not move. She understood, without being told, that this was not a moment that required anything from her. Not money, not a plan, not a solution, just presence. She sat down too, in the mud, in the rain, next to a man she had found and lost and found again across 10 years of guilt and systems and good intentions gone wrong. Neither of them spoke. The wind was dying. Somewhere inside the house, through the window, she could see the lamp still on in the living room, the small, warm circle of it, steady against the dark. Later, when they finally got Dorothy settled and came back out to the porch, the old woman looked up at Maya with the particular clarity that came and went without warning, and said in the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating something obvious, "You have the face of someone running from something." Maya did not answer. She didn't need to. She was still sitting in the mud when she said it, and for the first time in 10 years, she felt like she had finally stopped. The storm moved northeast before midnight. By 2 in the morning, the rain had slowed to something manageable. By 4, it had stopped almost entirely. The greenhouse was standing, bent in places, patched with whatever they'd had, one corner being held together by what was essentially rope and stubbornness, but standing. The beds they had managed to cover were intact. The harvest that mattered most had made it through the night. Ethan and Maya sat on the porch steps, side by side, too tired to do anything else. Dorothy had gone back inside at some point. Neither of them had noticed exactly when. Now she reappeared in the doorway with 2 mugs, moving carefully in her slippers across the wet porch boards, and pressed one into each of their hands, with the quiet authority of someone who has decided that, whatever is happening, hot coffee is the appropriate response to it. She sat down in the porch chair behind them and didn't say anything. For a long time, none of them did. Then Ethan said, without looking at her, "Why did you come?" Maya wrapped both hands around her mug. The rag he had tied around her palm was dirty and coming loose. "I don't know how to leave things alone," she said. "When I can see what's wrong and I know I can help." "That's not why." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not." He waited. "I think I needed to know that I could do something real," she said finally. "Not with money. Not with systems, just actually be useful. With my hands. The way you were." He didn't respond to that directly. He looked out at the farm, at the damaged beds, the surviving greenhouse, the first gray suggestion of light appearing at the edge of the sky. "The north beds are going to need replanting," he said. "I know. That's 3 weeks of work minimum." "I know." Another silence. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket, still damp, still tied around her waist, and took out a folded piece of paper. She set it on the step between them. "It's not a grant," she said, "it's a contract. Market rate, 3-year term. ClearPath buys everything Ember Acres produces. No minimum commitment on your end. You deliver what you grow. We pay what it's worth. And once a month, you come talk to my employees. About growing things. About working with your hands. About whatever you think people who stare at screens all day need to hear." He looked at the paper for a long time without touching it. "That's a real transaction," he said. "That's all I know how to offer that won't make you walk away." He picked it up, unfolded it, read it in the early morning light, slowly all the way through, the way he read everything. Then he folded it again and held it in his hand without giving it back. He looked out at the farm for a long time. At the greenhouse, bent, patched, held together by rope and two sets of hands, and a night neither of them would forget. At the north beds, half covered, half open to whatever the sky had left behind. At all the work that was still ahead. Then he looked at his own hands. Dirt under the nails. A cut along the left palm from the cable that had snapped. The hands of someone who had learned a long time ago that the only answer to loss was to put them back in the soil and start again. He thought about what she had said. A real transaction. Market rate? You deliver what you grow. We pay what it's worth. No charity dressed up as something else. No debt being quietly paid. Just two people, each with something the other needed, deciding to try. He didn't say any of this out loud. He just held the paper. Dorothy, from her chair behind them, said quietly and to no one in particular, "It's going to be a nice morning." And it was. The light came up slowly over the farm, pale orange first, then gold, spreading across the wet soil and the battered rows of green and the bent but standing frame of the greenhouse. Things were broken. Things were also alive. Most of what mattered had made it through. Ethan stood up eventually and walked out into the garden. He stood in the middle of it, looking at what the night had left behind. The damage, the survival, the work that was still ahead. Maya stood up too. She walked out and stood beside him. She didn't ask what came next. She didn't make a plan or run the numbers or identify the next problem to solve. She just stood there, in the muddy, battered, still-standing garden, in the early morning light, next to the man who had once pulled her out of the dark. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't feel like she owed the world anything. And for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't standing alone.